Good afternoon or good morning, depending on whether you're doing this inclusion and diversity at Waverley or in the city. At this very moment, I'm at a conference, a diversity conference in Hong Kong, so I'm very sorry not to be able to be here for the first session. But in due course, you'll probably be glad that I missed the first session, because you'll be so sick of me talking about inclusion and diversity by the end that it's probably a good thing to have a bit of an easy start. Although knowing Mary, she's going to be sitting in, she won't let you have a very easy start. So the first thing I want to talk about is that when I was very much younger than I am today, you'll see a picture of me on the corner there. I already had a great interest in inclusion and in diversity, and this is actually a picture of me learning a dance and a song that is sung to very young brides that are about to get married. And my interest in diversity and inclusion has continued over many, many years. Now, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be examining the outline and the assignments for the duration of the course. We're not going to spend too much time on the assignments, because next week when I'm back, we can have a much closer look at it. Because in any case, I don't want to miss that very important process of having everyone hanging on my every word, which only happens when you talk about assignments generally in a lecture. Then we're going to examine two different terms. What is our understanding of diversity and inclusion, and then a very brief overview of inclusion and exclusion. Now, assignment 1, as I said, you can see from the pie graph, because the other side is about 47%, the first and second generation combined. So there are many people living in the country that are fairly new in terms of their birth and ancestry and so on. And for whatever reason, Perth, Sydney and Melbourne have had the highest proportion of overseas born people, which was over a third each. And I suppose it's mainly because those are the city areas and the most well-known. For instance, when I lived in South Africa, we had a saying, packing for Perth, because many people only knew one country in the whole of Australia that they wanted to immigrate to, and that was Perth for whatever reason. So I find that really interesting in terms of diversity, that there are a large percentage of people who are first and second generation Australians. Then if we look at countries of birth, and I'm not going to worry too much about the per thousand, etc., but if we look at the proportion of all overseas born people, of course the biggest proportion is the United Kingdom, with 20.8%, because of Australia's kind of Commonwealth ties, etc. It makes sense that would be the biggest proportion of people to be moving to Australia. And then we look down, those are the other places that have the most people that have moved. New Zealand being the second one, then China, India, Vietnamese, Philippines, and then of course the most important country in the world, South Africa, with 2.8% proportion of people born overseas. Actually, it feels a lot more, because I seem to encounter many South Africans in Australia, but 2.8% is quite a large proportion. And then the bottom one is a combination of all of the people where else they were born. So that's why it's a large percentage, because it's made up of a very small percentage of different countries put together. Another interesting statistic is the number of males per 100 females. And you'll see that in some countries, definitely there are more males that have immigrated, but if you look at something like South Africa, 96.9, it means that there are slightly more females that have immigrated from South Africa to Australia. So if we continue to look around diversity, and we obviously know that statistics can sometimes be skewed because even though it is considered compulsory, many people might fall through the net, and there may well be larger numbers than sometimes is shown through statistics. But the statistics show that 54837 people are identified as being of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander origin, and some of them are, like 90% of them are identified as Aboriginal only, 6% Torres Strait Islander origin only, and then 4% are identified as both. So clearly in the Northern Territory there are more people identified as of Aboriginal descent, just under 27%. In all other jurisdictions, 4% or less of the population. And Victoria has the lowest proportion, 0.7 of the state total. That doesn't mean that we don't need to be looking at diversity issues in terms of Aboriginal cultures. I would argue that even where there is a completely monocultural society, we would still be needing to be sharing resources from different cultural practices. So if we look at the inclusion, which I had lost, is the process by which diverse groups of individuals are supported, respected and valued through creating affirming, welcoming spaces and climates that elicit a sense of belonging. And if you think about the frameworks, there is constantly that reference to belonging, being and becoming, which are all exceptionally important in terms of creating an inclusive society. It's the active, intentional and ongoing engagement with diversity in people, in the curriculum, in the co-curriculum and intellectual, social, cultural and geographical communities with which individuals might connect in ways that increase one's awareness, content knowledge, cognitive sophistication, and empathetic understanding of the complex ways individuals interact with systems. Now, that's quite a mouthful, but really what I think is important in there is to see that the diversity is much broader than just people. It's curriculum diversity, co-curriculum, different aspects of curriculum, intellectual, social, etc. The increasing awareness, content knowledge, understanding of the complex ways individuals interact. And as we go through this course, we'll be looking more carefully at that notion of complex ways and how complex actually culture is in terms of people not necessarily only being focused on one culture themselves, having multiple cultural identities that brings its own sense of complexity. So, inclusion, if we talk inclusion, it's founded basically on human rights principles, and we're all aware of human rights and what that entails. It's recognized in international law and conventions on the basis of consensus within the international community that they are inherent amongst humanity. Human rights generally focuses in inclusion on action and change, and how do we best change to accommodate and to value those human rights. And equity is key to both human rights and inclusion. And if you look at that picture there, I think it's a very good example of the difference between equity and equality. And often in educational circles we talk about the need for equality, but it is in fact far more important to look at equity, because equity is about fairness. It's about giving people the opportunity to engage. So if you look at that picture, there is equality on the left-hand side, and of course that poor little, I'm assuming they're all boys, because they look like it, but maybe they're girls, who knows. That poor little boy at the end can't see a thing. So he's not able to really engage in looking at that match. Whereas with equity, it's fair because they can all see, but he's been given a little bit more support in terms of those boxes that have been built up. And if we think about that, I used to get really tired when in the early days of human rights, when all we heard all the time was level the playing field. And but in a way, that's what is happening there, is they're leveling the playing field so that everyone can actually see. And it is a good, and it is a very effective way of ensuring equity. So, rights-based education. Rights-based approaches set out to foster meaningful engagement and participation so that people are provided with the space and resources to shape the decisions and initiatives that affect their lives. Now, rights-based education, what are rights? Human rights are about recognizing and respecting the inherent value and dignity of all people. Human rights standards are contained in internationally agreed human rights treaties and declarations. And if you look up there, you'll see a list of some of the documents that are available on internet and that have been created over the years. So human rights instruments relevant to student diversity, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but you can see that the earliest ones were right from 1951, and the latest ones around 2009 and so on. So, inclusion is seen as a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all children, youth and adults through increasing participation in learning cultures and communities, and reducing and eliminating exclusion within and from education. And as you can see, I have highlighted what I think is exceptionally important for us, and that's trying to find within educational spaces increasing participation in learning cultures and communities. It involves changes and modifications in content, approaches, structures and strategies with a common vision that covers all children, and a conviction that it is the responsibility of the regular system to educate all children. So inclusion is generally contrasted with exclusion, because we tend to, particularly in Western society, we tend to see things in polar dimensions, inclusion as opposed to exclusion. Historically, the emphasis was on poverty, and it was historically understood as a deficit rather than strength-based. So what someone or an individual group does not have, that was what was focused on. What they do not have, and particularly in relation to poverty. And hopefully Mary will have shown you, and Sue, sorry, because Sue's going to be doing it on Saturday, will show you that cracked pot video at the beginning of the session before they go on to my wonderful speech. And that really shows how it's a really great story emphasizing strength-based approaches to inclusion as opposed to deficit basis of inclusion. Poverty on its own does not provide a wide enough lens, but for many years when people talked about inclusion and exclusion, it was mostly poverty that was focused on. But that's definitely not a wide enough lens through which to see and understand the multifactorial impacts of social exclusion. So poverty is relative or absolute, can be relative. So if we think about poverty as being relative or absolute, if I was in the space with you, I would now be talking to you and trying to get your ideas of those two processes, absolute or relative. But I'll give you an example instead. These are two pictures that I took when I was still working in South Africa. And I was working in schools that you can clearly see there was a lot of poverty. This was the school building, which was falling apart. You can't really see, but the windows are pretty smashed up. If you look at the classroom inside, nothing on the walls. So there was both a poverty of education and poverty of the actual situation in which they found themselves. You'll also see that they're crowded around very few desks and tables. And so for me, that's an example of a really poor educational space. But it's all relative. Because when I came to Australia, I was taken to a school, and the first thing that people told me at that school was that this is a disadvantaged school. And I walked in, and I saw anything but, in my view, disadvantaged, because these students had everything that I could possibly wish for this school in South Africa. But it's relative. It's all relative, because in terms of an Australian community and an Australian society, this was seen as an impoverished, disadvantaged school. So we always need to be looking at those issues of inclusion and diversity within the context in which it happens. So in the 1990s, there was an expansion of the concept of inclusion and exclusion. And what the expansion entailed mostly, I'll leave you to read this yourself, but just mostly the fact that we now no longer just talk about poverty, we talk about other important dimensions of inclusion and exclusion. So social exclusion happens when there's a series of problems. So all of those factors, unemployment, discrimination, low income, etc., might all be within one picture of a particularly inclusive or exclusive society. So the concept of social exclusion is broader than a focus just on material resources, on income. People can be socially excluded even if they have sufficient income or material resources. What you can do later on is to just record how you think people have been socially excluded. That is beyond just material resources and income and so on. And we'll discuss it at a later point. So if we look at social exclusion, here are some of the ways in which societies or people can be excluded, and these are taken from the UNESCO document, which I have up for you on Moodle. So abused children, child labourers, etc. Have a look at that list. Some of them you may not have thought about, or some of them you may have. HIV/AIDS, orphans is a very strong exclusionary, social exclusion within a lot of African countries particularly. Children in conflict zones, etc. I haven't lost my place, I'm just pausing so that you can have a look at that list. So what are the different dimensions? A person is socially excluded if he or she is unable for whatever reason I'll start again. A person is socially excluded if he or, fortunately there is editing processes. A person is socially excluded if he or she is unable for whatever reason to fully access or participate in the key activities and resources of society. So there are 4 dimensions: consumption, production, political engagement, and social interaction. And my heart really goes out to this little boy. I found this picture somewhere, I don't even know, and I'm going to be up for copyright infringement because I don't know where I got it from. But you can just see how much he wants to be in that circle, but he is just excluded in some way, shape, or form. A bit like when I go to a cocktail party. I feel the same way sometimes when I try to engage in that cocktail party. Okay, so the 4 aspects are consumption, production, political engagement, and social interaction. So if we look at consumption, it's all about being able to buy goods and services, production, be able to participate economically, political engagement, involvement in decision making, and social interaction, being able to integrate and participate with family, friends, and community. So as I've been trying to clarify, and I've probably over-clarified it at this point, the understanding of inclusion and exclusion expanded in the late 1990s. Social exclusion is relative, but its effects are ongoing and cumulative. So if you're excluded on one level, that impacts on how you operate in society, and so other factors will come along and it will be like a cyclical effect. It's relative to the prevailing social norms, standards, and expectations. Children may be excluded in schools because or in early childhood spaces because they don't necessarily fit the expectations within that space. Agency is involved. That is, it's not inevitable. It is caused by an act or some individual, group, or institution. A person may exclude themselves by choice, or they may be excluded by the decisions of other people, organizations, or institutions. It's not confined to current circumstances. If children are excluded, it also may limit their future prospects. So social exclusion is said to be a dynamic process, best described as descending levels. Some disadvantage lead to exclusion, which in turn leads to more disadvantage and more social exclusion and disadvantage, and it ends up with persistent multiple deprivation, disadvantages. Individuals, households, and spatial units can be excluded from access to resources like employment, health, education, social or political life, and it's often this kind of domino effect. So social inclusion is about overcoming the barriers that cause people to feel exclusion. Social inclusion is making sure people are connected socially and in their broader community. And there are certain people within a community that may be seen as particularly vulnerable and needing more support in order to remain within an inclusive society. So these are some of the factors that may affect social inclusion. And it's going to take far too long for us to have a discussion around this. So again, just look at the slide, think about ways in which people are socially excluded, and we'll come back to it next week. So another definition or another way of looking at social inclusion, and particularly in terms of education. Inclusive education is a process of strengthening the capacity of the education system to reach out to all learners. As an overall principle, it should guide all educational policies and practices, starting from the fact that education is a basic human right and the basics of a more just and equal society. So if we look at approaches to education, it's along a continuum, and in the good or bad old days, this was where inclusion was set, in this sort of special education sector. And by saying that, And by saying that I do support this kind of inclusion, that's not saying that I don't think that different people have different needs and that there may be a place for special education depending on the circumstances, situation, and abilities of children. But we've generally moved away from that to that, where inclusion locates problems in the environment, not the child. It adapts to the environment, to the child, and respects diversity, and promotes equity of access in the same way as we saw that picture of the children in a row, getting equity to access that game. Very vague about that game because I'm not sure what kind of game it is. It looked like a cricket match to me, but what I know about sport is a bit dangerous. So, international legal context, putting it into an international legal concept, starting from 1948, which is when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights first appeared, up to 2007, where the United Nations created the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So again, have a look at that. Women at least sort of started to get a look in 79, children 89, and so on. Diversity and Cultural Expression, 2005. We're getting towards, we've got a few more, okay. So now this one, can you see that very clearly? I was just talking to my camera operator. So we start off at the top, which is the education system has the full responsibility to ensure the right to education. So all children have a basic right to education. So how is education equipped and ready to handle diversity? It's equipped and ready to handle diversity when there are flexible teaching and learning methods, when there are reorientating teacher education, in other words, doing more teacher education, more quality teacher education, where there's flexible curricula, and where there's a response to diverse need, and it's not overloaded with academic content, which I hope today's lecture hasn't been. I think it probably has been, but never mind, you will survive. Welcoming of diversity, the involvement of parents in the community, and early identification and remediation of children at risk. And we'll be talking quite a lot in the next couple of weeks about children's vulnerabilities and children at risk and how we help children and support children to become resilient in very exclusive situations. And so from how the education system is equipped, we go to the more practical side of it, engaging with flexible teaching methods, with innovative approaches to teaching aids and equipments, as well as the use of ICT. So all the sort of 21st century tools that we have to increase that teaching flexibility. And then from there, we move into what is exceptionally important in inclusion and diversity, and that's having responsive, child-friendly environments and professional environments working deliberately and actively to promote inclusion for all. And that's where even the best intention centres sometimes fall down a little bit because they think they're doing inclusion and diversity, but some of them don't necessarily take enough time to think about deliberately and actively promoting inclusion, and so on. Lots of and so ons happening now. I'm getting tired. Okay, so according to the Melbourne... move on. So according to the Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young Australians, Australian schools must provide all students with access to high-quality schooling that is free from discrimination based on gender, language, sexual orientation, pregnancy, culture, ethnicity, religion, health or disability, socio-economic background, or geographic location. This kind of jars for me, this pregnancy in the middle of that list, but, you know, that's what it says. And I think it's because they really don't want to exclude any sort of form, so rather than leaving poor pregnant people out, it's put in. But it does seem to, it seems more of a specific than some of those general sort of terms that are there. So the reason why I've talked about the Melbourne Declaration is A, because of its importance in terms of inclusion and diversity, but B, because in 2005, Drama Australia, that I'm very involved with, and it's known to be the Peak Drama Educators Association in Australia, launched a groundbreaking document on equity and diversity, which was particularly related to drama and theatre education. But I would argue strongly that if one looks at the Drama and Australia policy documents, that it's equally applicable to anyone in education teaching any subject matter. So it was titled the Drama Australia Equity and Diversity Guidelines, and its aim was to reflect on the ways in which gender, sexuality, disability, and cultural and linguistic issues impact on drama education. Now, the reason why we specifically put those in is that the new one, which I'll show you now in a minute, as she has another one, it has socio-economic status, which was not actually included in that 2005 original document. So in 2013, no, we're in 2015, not 2013. 2015, very recently, I was involved in revising that document, and it's going to be launched in July at the Drama Australia Conference in Sydney. It has that extra socio-economic status attached to it. Now, one of the things that is in there is each of the different aspects have some guideline principles prior to a document that discusses how to use drama to promote equity, etc. So this is the part that I was involved with, and it's a very small part of the document, but it's looking at, this is the general one. This is the one that's overriding, and then we go to more specific. So all of us agreed that these were some of the things that we would like to look at when it comes to equity and diversity. Equity, inclusiveness, pluralism, which is acknowledging differences and multiple perspectives and so on. Diversity and empowerment. Freedom from constraint and the freedom to develop towards one's human potential. And this is the one, as you can see, Carter in Drama Australia 2015, which is the start of my cultural and linguistic part of the document. And it's a very small part, and I will probably be showing you the whole document at some point, because I think there are a lot of sort of really good aspects of it, even if I may say so myself. And this is just the beginning. So what are some of the things that I feel very strongly in terms of diversity? Honouring and respecting cultural and linguistic diversity in educational settings. Developing and using drama curriculum and processes that are responsible to diverse needs. Of course, again, I'll reiterate that doesn't only necessarily apply to drama, but this is a drama document. Embracing the possibilities of rich, unique cultural and linguistic, human and environmental resources. So all the resources that you can embrace in order to have an impact on equity. establishing drama classroom practices that reflect and value dramatic convention and characteristics of culturally and linguistically diverse communities. So again, getting those characteristics and looking at them carefully, providing opportunities for students to utilize their linguistic and cultural capital and funds of knowledge in creating and responding to drama processes and products, again, in responding to any kind of educational processes, making real use of those linguistic and cultural capitals and funds of knowledge that children bring to the educational environment, and encouraging students to explore and express cultural identities and multiple perspectives. And that's a particularly important part of drama, is that ability to take on different roles and look at those multiple perspectives. And so, thereby, ended this marathon, feels like a marathon, and those are some of the things that I have consulted, but this will all be up on Moodle. And I will also be taking you through a process for the tutorial, which you may do in the tutorial space. Saturday you don't have an option. Saturday you have to stay. But those of you who feel you can do the work on your own, in your own time, you can do that. But just give me the opportunity to explain to you what needs to be done.